before he made $100 million from a grill, before he became the oldest heavyweight champion in history. George Foreman was a broke ex-fighter who thought he had seen hell. But he wasn't just a knockout artist. He was a man who terrified his opponents with every punch, then somehow transformed into one of the most beloved, larger-than-life figures the sport has ever seen. His career was filled with spectacular highs, desperate lows, and a level of reinvention that few athletes have ever pulled off. But what really made George Foreman who he was? Big George Foreman hit it, and he is knocked out. George Foreman, how did a poor kid from Texas go from Olympic gold to the heavyweight throne, only to fall? Before writing history's most remarkable comeback, to truly understand the man behind the legend, we need to go back to where it all started, long before the bright lights and roaring crowds. Let's take a look at the life and legacy of the one and only George Foreman. I am the danger, I'm the one to be afraid of. Definitely. I'm the one who can hit you and knock you unconscious. Foreman was born on January 10, 1949, in Marshall, Texas, one of 7 siblings. His biological father went by Leroy Moorhead, but that was just a name on paper. Foreman took the name of his stepfather, J.D. Foreman, the man who actually raised him. When the family moved to Houston, young George didn't just fall in with the wrong crowd. He was the wrong crowd. He was always the first to admit. He was an angry and violent kid who constantly got into fights. And by 15 years old, he dropped out of school and resorted to mugging. Just to scrape by. He wasn't just some troubled teen. He was on a fast track to either prison or an early grave. But at 16, something clicked. Maybe it was luck, maybe fate, but Foreman found himself in the Job Corps, learning carpentry and bricklaying. Except George wasn't built for laying bricks. He was built for breaking them. Well, after joining Job Corps in 6'5", I've learned a skill in electronics, and I received my high school diploma equivalency. And I'm pretty much on the right road. I've learned to set goals, and the Job Corps, a helpful program to me through the Job Corps. He was introduced to boxing, and as soon as he laced up a pair of gloves, it became clear knocking people unconscious was something he had more than just a passing talent for. It took him just 3 years. 3 years to go from street fights and petty crime to standing on the podium at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics with a gold medal hanging around his neck. It was the kind of transformation that should have been impossible. And that Olympic gold, it was Foreman's golden ticket to the pros. He wasted no time making a statement, racking up 13 wins in his first year, 11 by knockout. Over the next few years, his career followed the same familiar pattern, with fighter after fighter entering the ring, and Foreman knocking them all out. In his first 37 fights, only 3 opponents managed to hear the final bell. Then came Joe Frazier, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. But on the night of the fight in Kingston, Jamaica, Frazier didn't put up much more of a fight than the 37 boxers who came before him. Foreman knocked him down 6 times in 2 rounds, finishing him off like it was just another day at the office. It wasn't just a win, it was a destruction. 3 times. The fight is stopped. The once troubled boy from Texas was the heavyweight champion of the world. For a man who would go down as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, Foreman's reign as champion was surprisingly short-lived. He managed to defend his newly won title just twice, though his second defense was no walk in the park. His opponent, Kenny Norton, the man who had shocked the world by breaking Muhammad Ali's jaw and handing him a loss. Foreman made quick work of Norton, demolishing him in 2 rounds. But then came Ali himself, and everything changed. Or are they going to stop it? It looks like it may be all over. And it is all over. George Foreman retains the heavyweight championship. By this point, Ali was 32, and had already been through wars in the ring, and a long exile from boxing. Many believed his best days were behind him. The snarling and formidable Big George, however, was stronger. younger, and meaner. Not only did he go into a fight as a huge favorite, but people genuinely feared for Ollie's safety. Some thought he wouldn't leave the ring in one piece. Even Ollie's own team seemed worried. But Ollie himself, he wasn't. He never was. What happened next is the stuff of legend. When the two stepped into the ring in Kinshasa, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, like almost everyone else, Foreman was dismissive of Ollie's chances. He expected nothing other than an easy win by first or second round KO, just like he did with Frazier and Norton. But Ollie had other plans. Instead of running from Foreman's power, he leaned into it literally. He introduced his now famous rope-a-dope tactics, leaning back on the ropes and letting Foreman swing away. And Big George did just that, punching and punching, throwing everything he had. But the more he punched, the more Ollie taunted. By the fourth round, Foreman knew something was wrong. He had landed some of his best shots, but Ollie was still there, still talking. At one point, Ollie leaned in and sneered, "Is that the best you got, George?" That was the moment Foreman realized he was the wrong man, in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the eighth, Foreman was exhausted, and Ollie, still fresh, saw his moment. In a flash, he unleashed a lightning combination of his own, sending Foreman crashing to the canvas. The count reached 10, and just like that, the unbeatable monster had been beaten. Foreman took the loss hard, real hard. He didn't just lose the fight. He lost everything. He had been built up as an unstoppable force, and now he was left searching for answers. He blamed the delay caused by a pre-fight cut. He claimed the ropes had been deliberately loosened to favor Ollie's tactics. He even suggested that his own trainer had drugged him. But perhaps what stung the most was how the world saw them. Ollie was the hero, celebrated and adored. Foreman, he was cast as the villain. And after all the trash talk, the insults, and the build-up, Foreman had to live with the fact that, when it came time for revenge, he couldn't deliver. After this crushing loss, Foreman disappeared from the ring for nearly a year. And when he did return, it wasn't with a comeback fight. It was with a stunt. He set up an exhibition where he would take on 5 opponents in one night, desperate to prove, perhaps as much to himself as to everyone else, that he was still the same unstoppable force. But it backfired, sure. He took out the first few guys, but the last who went the distance, the man who once bulldozed Joe Frazier, was now unable to finish a couple of journeymen. By the end of the show, he found himself being booed out of the ring. This wasn't exactly the triumphant return or confidence boost he was hoping for. His ego was still bruised after the Ollie loss. And now this, he needed something real. A real fight, and what better way to test himself than against Ron Lyle, one of the most dangerous punchers in the division. Some comeback fight after a year-long layoff. Right, Foreman could have picked a tune-up. Instead, he walked straight into a battle that turned out to be arguably the most exciting heavyweight matchup of the 70s. Never seen it. Imagine Hagler versus Hearns in the heavyweight, and you'll get an idea of how it went down. Lyle wasn't just a power puncher. He was fearless, and from the opening bell, both men went at it, trading blows in the center of the ring. In the third, Foreman was knocked down to the canvas. Lyle smelled blood. But then, with Lyle closing in for the finish, from out of nowhere, Foreman produced a barrage of punches that stunned Lyle and turned the tables, sending him slumping to the floor, out cold in one of the most dramatic finishes the sport had ever seen. Their legendary encounter was so insane, Ring Magazine named it Fight of the Year. And the third round alone, Round of the Year. With this win, Foreman signaled to the world Big George was back. And if that wasn't clear enough, he underlined it by demolishing Frazier for the second time in his next fight. But then, just when it looked like he was on the road back to the title, he was involved in a fight that would change the course of his life forever. In 1977, 2.5 years after losing to Ollie, Foreman found himself in Puerto Rico, set to face Jimmy Young, and again, he was guilty of overlooking his opponent. Young was a skilled and accomplished fighter. He himself had recently scored a win over Lyle, and wasn't to be taken lightly. It should have been a routine win. Foreman had the power to take him out. At least that's what he thought. What he didn't take seriously was the heat. Foreman arrived just a day before the fight, giving himself zero time to acclimate to Puerto Rico's brutal humidity. A mistake. A costly one. Young boxed smart, making Foreman look sluggish and one-dimensional. By the later rounds, exhaustion was setting in. Foreman was fading, and in the final round, Young dropped him. The second shock defeat of his career. But that was nothing compared to what was about to happen next. When he got back to his changing room, Foreman collapsed. He was completely drained physically and mentally. And that's when it happened. What he later described as a near-death experience. He claimed he saw visions of death, of hell. He heard God speaking to him. In his desperation, he offered to donate his prize money to charity in return for being spared, to which God supposedly replied with the chilling words, "I don't want your money, I want you." As it happened, though, God didn't take him that day. And when he woke up, he wasn't just a beaten fighter. He was a changed man that night. George Foreman walked away from boxing and into the church. He would spend the next 10 years as a preacher, leaving behind the sport that had made him a superstar. Or so he thought. The George Foreman story could have so easily ended there. He could have spent the rest of his life as a preacher, forever remembered as the destroyer turned disciple, the man who walked away from boxing after a vision of hell, but it didn't. And for two reasons: bad investments and a big heart. Foreman made millions in the 70s, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, without ever having to work again. But like so many fighters before him, he spent it. Some of it went into failed business ventures, some into his passion for cars, and a whole lot into his youth center in Houston, where he poured his own money into helping kids stay off the streets. But by the mid-80s, Foreman was nearly broke. So at the age of 38, long past the point where any sane person would think about stepping back into a boxing ring, Foreman did something insane. He announced his comeback, partly to raise money for his youth center, partly to refill his own bank account, and partly to prove that age didn't have to be a death sentence for an athlete. Nobody took him seriously. I mean, he was pushing 40 and weighed over 260 pounds. He started out fighting a few nobodies, and maybe he wasn't the same lean, mean wrecking machine he had been in the 70s. But he was knocking them all out with the old, formidable power he had always possessed. But as the knockouts kept piling up, the weight started coming off. Suddenly people stopped laughing. He kept fighting, and he kept knocking people out. And eventually he worked his way to the top, to gain a shot at undisputed heavyweight king, Evander Holyfield. Now Holyfield himself is an all-time great. And back then he was in his prime. Everyone expected him to take Foreman apart. Except that didn't happen. Foreman might have lost, but he gave Holyfield a fight. He pushed him 12 hard rounds, took his best shots, and never hit the canvas. He proved he wasn't just some old novelty act. He was still a serious fighter. Undeterred, he fought on. He lost a decision to Tommy Morrison for the WBO title, then considered a fringe belt. But his story still wasn't over, because then came his final date with Destiny 1994. Michael Moore, the undefeated WBA and IBF heavyweight champion. People forget that Moore was no joke. He wasn't just someone put in there for an aging legend to beat. He was the real deal, a legit undefeated world champion. And he was 19 years younger than Foreman. But what then transpired in the ring went down in the history books and broke several records that are unlikely to be broken again anytime soon. For 9 rounds, the script played out just as expected. Moore was well ahead on the cards, looking like he would cruise to a comfortable victory. Then in the 10th, lightning struck. The aging Foreman unleashed one sweet right hand to Moore's chin, laying him flat out on the canvas. He tried to rise, he couldn't. And so at the improbable age of 45, George Foreman had just become the heavyweight champion of the world. 20 years after his devastating loss to Ali, he was champion again, the oldest in history. It was a moment so unbelievable, so impossible, that it felt like a Hollywood script. But it wasn't, it was real. And it cemented George Foreman as one of the greatest and most remarkable heavyweights to ever lace up the gloves. After pulling off one of the most unbelievable feats in boxing history, Foreman wasn't done just yet. He fought for more times, defending his title 3 times, before finally losing a controversial decision to Shannon Briggs in 1997, a fight many believe he actually won. And with that, Big George finally called it a day for real. This time his final record reads 81 fights, 76 wins, 5 losses, and 68 of those wins coming by way of knockout. When it comes to the hardest punchers in heavyweight history, fans will always argue Ernie Shavers, Mike Tyson, Sonny Liston, and more recently, Deontay Wilder all have a case. But when you look at the numbers, the destruction, and the sheer fear factor Foreman brought into the ring, it's no doubt that Big George could punch with the best of them. And there are plenty who consider him to have been the biggest hitter of them all. What nobody can argue with are the records he shattered. By beating Moore at 45 years and 299 days, he became the oldest heavyweight champion of the world in history, an incredible feat in what can accurately be described as a young man's sport. The 20-year gap between his first and second reign is the longest in history, and the 19-year age difference between Foreman and Moore also the biggest ever in a heavyweight title fight. And here's something a lot of people don't realize. Foreman's comeback wasn't just a gimmick. It was practically a whole second career. When he retired the first time, he had fought 47 fights. But post-comeback he fought 34 more times. That's more fights than some so-called legends have in their entire careers. People might have laughed when an overweight 38-year-old George Foreman put the gloves back on. But when he finally walked away for good, it was clear he was no joke. He proved his point. Age didn't have to be a death sentence in boxing. And beyond that, he achieved exactly what he set out to do. Not just for himself, but for his family's security and his youth center's future. That's what makes George Foreman's story so incredible. He wasn't just a great fighter. He was a man who rewrote the rules. But what he's most remembered for depends entirely on who you ask. If you watched him fight in the 70s, you'll remember a wrecking machine, a terrifying puncher who mowed down almost everyone in his path. The man who knocked Frazier down 6 times, who crushed Norton, who went to war with Ron Lyle, and who fought in one of the most legendary bouts of all time against Muhammad Ali. If you came up in the 90s, you probably remember a very different George Foreman, the bald-headed, pudgier, but still dangerous veteran who, against all odds, fought his way back to the top. And if you're from an even younger generation, well, you might just remember him for selling you a grill. Yep, the George Foreman grill was an absolute phenomenon. At one point it seemed like every household had one, all because of its claim to drain the fat from food, making meals healthier, and having transformed and defying time to become world champ at 45. He was the perfect face for the product. And here's the kicker, that grill didn't just sell well. It made Foreman richer than boxing ever did. His deal with the company was worth an estimated $100 million, far more than he ever earned inside the ring. He also made other occasional TV appearances on shows like The Masked Singer. With that money, Foreman lived out his final years exactly how he wanted to, and he deserved to. He bought himself a 300-acre ranch, built a custom garage to house his 60-car collection, raised thoroughbred horses, and had 20 German shepherds roaming the property. Not bad for a kid who once roamed the streets of Texas with nothing but his fists. By the time he passed, George Foreman was worth around $300 million, a far cry from the troubled youth he once was. But for all his success, Foreman never forgot about family. He was married 5 times and had 12 children. And in a move that many found quirky, vain, or downright strange, he named all 5 of his sons George. But for good reason. Why? Because he wanted them to always have something in common. And when one went up, they would all go up. And when one went down, they would all go down. It was his way of keeping his family close and together. He also became a proud grandfather, and even great-grandfather. Before he passed, George Foreman wasn't just one man. He was many. He went through several distinct phases and transformations. Throughout his life, he didn't just evolve. He reinvented himself completely. After deciding to leave his life of crime behind him, he was the fresh-faced, 19-year-old gold medalist at the Mexico City Olympics. After his final victory, he waved a small American flag in celebration. A simple, innocent show of patriotism. But not everyone saw it that way. It was the peak of the civil rights movement, and the image of black athletes protesting, like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, raising their fists during the national anthem, was powerful. Some saw Foreman's flag waving as an endorsement of the system they were fighting against. Foreman, though, he had no idea. "I didn't wave the flag to make a statement. I waved it because I was happy," he later explained. But by the time he turned pro, that naive Olympic kid was gone. Foreman crafted an intimidating persona based on one of boxing's most fearsome figures, Sonny Liston. Liston was an occasional sparring partner of his. Foreman studied him, adopted his demeanor, and soon carried that same aura of menace. In the 70s, Foreman was pure destruction, a silent, brooding knockout machine. He would glare at opponents with dead eyes, barely acknowledging reporters with more than a grunt. He didn't need words, his fists did all the talking. And when at 45 years old, he shocked the world by knocking out Michael Moore to reclaim the heavyweight title, his legacy was forever cemented. Later, though, his demeanor had changed again. He had a near-death experience, found God, and walked away from the sport to become a preacher. When he returned to boxing a decade later, he was unrecognizable. The terrifying, silent destroyer had been replaced by a cheerful veteran with a big heart and an even bigger smile. Fans loved him. He had gone from one of the most feared to one of the most beloved boxers of all time. Then came the final reinvention. By the time he became a TV personality and the face of the grill, the transformation was complete. An elder statesman of boxing with charm and charisma, a million miles from what he had been as the taciturn knockout artist of the 70s. In his later years, even his animosity towards his one-time conqueror Ali mellowed, and the pair became extremely close friends. The older George Foreman was never short of praise for Muhammad Ali, and often spoke of how he missed him. After Ali passed away, of course, Foreman never completely lost his fighter's mentality. Even in his later years, he wasn't afraid to stir the pot. He let it be known that he felt Mike Tyson lacked heart, and he was openly critical of Deontay Wilder's mental state after his losses to Tyson Fury. And if a journalist ever questioned his legacy, he wasn't afraid to fire back, even as an old man. But what was his legacy? It isn't just about numbers, titles, or defenses, it's about impact. He was a two-time heavyweight champion who smashed Frazier twice. He ran through Ken Norton. He waged war with Ron Lila. And yet, despite all his destruction, his most famous moment was arguably his loss to Muhammad Ali. But those stats don't do justice to his presence, his persona, the excitement he brought. So how would he have done against the heavyweights of today? It's a debate that rages on. Many say he'd wipe the floor with them. And honestly, it's hard to argue. But let's play devil's advocate. Today's heavyweights are bigger. They're taller, they have more advanced training, nutrition, and recovery methods. At 6'3", the same as Alexander Usyk, who is now considered small for a heavyweight, Big George would no longer be seen as the formidable giant he was. In his own era, would he struggle against the behemoths like Tyson Fury? Maybe. For what it's worth, there's no doubt that in his prime, he would have given any of them an extremely tough night, and probably would have knocked most of them out. But this is a discussion for boxing fans to have for themselves, and there are no definitive answers. All we can do is imagine him facing off against the boxers of today. George Foreman's legacy as a boxer, as a Hall of Famer, and simply as a great man is set in stone. His recent passing is a massive loss to the sport. Boxing lost one of its true giants, both in the ring and outside of it. But legends never really die. Their stories live on, their fights are rewatched, and their impact is never forgotten. So here's to you, Big George. You gave us knockouts, drama, comebacks, and an unforgettable ride. Thanks for all the memories. You truly were someone special.